دوثينا لومم لودتري كتيو دي حوارتيدن دكتور جابرييلا يونان كتيوم بحنونيثو دي شعثو قاميتو بوريفيد كومانو دا حورونيذن تكذعيلا مذكرة إيش ما بري بشمو لكلوزم عمقنا بو مكتب زبنو وبو ميد السملة أبو حون السملة علو عامو سوريويو بكثو دفرسلا بقاميتو كومانو الكل أيو لوفي ولما الفون دعدو زي هاون مبعو دوف الحونو علوقا كيبان بلكي مدينة وزبنو دي سانة دمشقرين على لف الحون السملة استي وحاضرنا تشمعينا كمو ملحاثي علوف الحونيذا ما حطلا تحتو اسمه Genocide and Diaspora a history that does not pass. Shano.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I wasn't dreaming that I will speak after a person, Dr. Chetris, who prepared the soil for me so that I could say will be continued. Though my view, my aspects are different, but it was a very great help. Thank you very much that I can start. My paper is in a way narrative. It's not a deep analysis because 20 minutes are too short. It's now 25 years since my book, A Forgotten Holocaust, was published. I remember, or any author, after finishing a book and giving it out of hand, is under attention and expectation what will happen, how will be the reaction. But there was no reaction. 1989, the book was published. After a while, there were some reviews by German academics, and then some libraries took it, but from the Assyrians, there was no reaction. For 10 years, no reaction. Of course, it doesn't mean that the one or the other has read it, and I am speaking of the German-speaking Assyrians in the diaspora, because it was written in German. So, after a while, I was thinking the title has a double meaning. A forgotten Holocaust, not only forgotten by the world, but by the Assyrians themselves. And this was true. There was a silence, and this was maybe not a silence only by trauma, but there was a gap of about nearly 3 generations of not knowing about what happened. Doesn't mean that there was never a subject genocide. In the beginning, after the post-war years, they're very eager, the Assyrians who went to Paris Peace Conference wrote booklet in French, in English, and they were aware of what they experienced. But when this was over, clearly to say after Lausanne conference, there fell silence on this issue. And it lasted, it would have maybe another generation without diaspora, then we can say there would be a silence forever. But then happened the diaspora, the beginning of the diaspora. And of course, in the first years, the first decades, we can see the people had to look for their making a life. They could not go to libraries, and even if they would not have be able to understand. Interestingly, in 1968, in the first conference of the Assyrian Universal Union in Pau in France, there was a declaration of one day, the 9th of August, to be a memorial day for the massacre in Semile. And the massacre in Semile, which is now Iraq and Kurdistan, was of course not the great genocide, but in a way it was belonging to the genocide. It is maybe also interesting, referring to my to Dr. Chavez, when I was in the process of writing this book, Some of you will remember Shlimon Yonan, which was in that time my husband, so we discussed this. And I remember 1987 maybe, I said to him, Shlimon, are you aware that your Assyrian people is in the same way a victim of genocide like the Armenians? And he answered, so what? We are not interested on the past, we are looking to the future. So this was even in a way of a kind of aggressiveness. He didn't want to discuss it. So, I mean, because we discuss a lot of other issues in Assyrian, and he was one of the first generation activists in the diaspora, but genocide was something which was beyond what this group wanted to know. It was then 10 years after, about 1998, 1999, when a first group of diaspora Assyrians approached me, and this was a special group, the leftists in that time under the name Doronoye, and they worked in that time with the PKK Kurds and also were with Met TV in Brussels. They were the first to invite me several times to make interviews about genocide and to not only read it or reprint it in their magazines, but they really tried in a way to analyze it, not in a real academic way, but it was the beginning. Then there was something, even today, when I was thinking about this, I was wondering how it came to this coincidence. It was the year 2000, and this was a turning point, and from then on, genocide became an issue for the Assyrians, even now for the non-Assyrians. What happened was that there were many things. First, it was a time that a second generation was grown and could discuss. But at the same time, it happened that a court case came up. It was the arresting and the trial against a priest of a very small parish in Diyarbakir, the Rasha Yusuf Akbulut, which just by chance, I can say only by chance and some reasons, because the big issue was that the diaspora Armenians tried to get recognition in America and made big stress in America. Clinton, it was the time of Clinton. And even the Turkish foreign minister canceled his visit. So some Turkish journalists tried to get some informations to make a fuss of this Armenian recognition. But the Armenians were silent, they didn't talk in Istanbul. So two of these journalists went to Diyarbakir and were then coming to that little church in Diyarbakir, which was belonging to Rasha Akbulut, and he didn't even know that this was an interview and this will be printed. He was the one who spoke out and said, yes, there was not only Armenians, our people, Syrian, we were 160,000. Now nobody is here, only 30 people. And then next day it was in the newspaper and he was arrested. And this became an international issue by chance. So this was a beginning. But from then on, it was like a marathon. In the year 2000, there were the first conference in Sydney about Assyrian genocide. In the same year, there was a conference in California by American Assyrians. Then Brussels came, and from then on, there was a lot of things, conferences, workshops, memorial days. In all Western Europe, which is our subject, but diaspora of Assyrians, as we all know, is much bigger. Australia, America, Russia, 2002, the first conference of genocide in Russia. Then it started scholarly researches. a thesis, the first thesis came out, written by Assyrian. I'm speaking now from Assyrian. My time was over, but then the Assyrians were able to be interested on this issue. And from then on, there are published books, articles, film documents. That means the silence of decades was broken. I will not speak about my book, because the German written book was not able. There were not many people outside the German-speaking community who could read it. It was like a sesame open, and it was even in the political theater, there was a struggle for recognition by motions in Sweden, in Austria, in Switzerland, even in Germany, and there were then memorials. We have memorials now in the last 5 years or 6 years. One is in Russian, one is, by the way, in Chicago, and one courtyard, in one yard, and of course Brussels and Yerevan. No, Liège, you told me Liège, sorry, yeah. That means, and this was all done on initiative by Assyrians. This was in several of my speeches. I say the year 2000 was a turning point for the Assyrian diaspora to become aware and to build an identity of the history of genocide. I must say, it will never be such a strong tool or means for identity like it is for Armenians or Jewish. The Assyrians, in my opinion, have other priorities. There is religion, there is language issue, but now it becomes an issue of identity. But in my opinion, not in the same way that it will become a centerpiece of identity. Then, very interesting, the Assyrians had to struggle on two fronts, on two, what is the English word? I mean, on two way. The one was the Turks, of course. The Turks, very far, I mean, they rejected the Armenians, and they wasn't even willing to talk with the Assyrians or to discuss it. It was just nonsense. But there was another front, and this was the Armenians. The Armenians who want, with the diaspora, I'm speaking about the diaspora Armenians, they struggled very strong against their wish to protect the uniqueness or the exclusiveness of the first genocide in the 20th century. They didn't want to give up this privilege, which is similar to the Holocaust, who was much broader than only the Jews, though I will not demonize this, but we know that 3.5 million of Russians and other people from Europe were non-Jewish, were also victims. So this was a very special situation. Maybe I should mention that it doesn't mean that there were any Armenian who was giving solidarity. Maybe some of you remember that one of the first short story, 70,000 Assyrians, by William Saroyan, who is a hero, a writer for the Armenians. He wrote in 1935 in English a short story book, and the first story is about the Assyrian genocide. And then there were, I believe it is maybe referring also to Semile, but it's not he doesn't speak about Semile. He speaks about war, about First World War. So, what are the reasons for the acknowledgement of genocide? Why is this important? Or how can we come to this point that it will become close to a recognition? I think the first very important thing education of the, as it now is on the process, education about this history, which is a point of history. It's not the whole history of the Assyrians, but is an important point of the modern history of Assyrians. Then, of course, why, was it so pushed, this issue? Of course, the influence, the Western influence, because especially in Germany, but also in the Western European country, that the Jewish Holocaust, every young student who goes in school has to learn it. So this has also an influence. Despite Holocaust is not a term which the Jews accept, they reject it because they don't feel that they were persecuted because of religious reason, but of race reason. And Holocaust is of religious reason. Therefore, I used this term as a title in my book. Last not least, in favor of this education is the technological network, which make it possible to exchange materials and documents and to organize events, for example, like this, but also others, to discuss the genocide in the internet. I remember even 1999, when the Holocaust book was translated into Turkish and published, which I didn't know that it was published in Istanbul. There was a huge Turkish group, and I couldn't understand about what it is. There was one, Ibrahim Sever, who was the one who was trying to discuss. So I mean, internet is a very important thing. Finally, coming to the conclusion, there are many questions still open, and there needs much more research work to look more detail to the fact, and it will take time and work for maybe the next and over next generation to close these gaps. The Turks had to learn that the genocide will not date out, and that they have no more power to silence the former dhimmis. You know, dhimmi, what was a kind of slave. Let's take the latest statement of the Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan, which he addressed in April 24 as a first step in the right direction, though it has maybe another reason. Despite the main address were the Armenians, but he also included all the peoples of Anatolia who suffered from the hardship of the events during the World War. I will shorten it. Assyrians may, because we spoke about identity and integration, assimilation. In my opinion, Assyrians in the diaspora may lose the language, maybe in the next generation. They may change their religion or confession and give up customs, change their names, but they will never be able to change their history. It is important to do the utmost to dig up and to give it over, to hand it over, the history, the facts of the history, to the next generations who follow. Thank you very much.